Thank you, Field Trip Health, for that brief video. Field Trip Health offers immersive therapies that combine the latest science of psychedelic medicine to help cure people. Field Trip Health is the sponsor of today's salon, and we're very, very pleased that you're on board with us. To everybody else, hello, good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Sarah Jane Demy of Demy-Colton, and on behalf of Demy-Colton and our team, today's sponsor and our other sponsors and supporters, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 22nd installment of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series, Psychedelics Get Serious. We welcome all of our past participants back again, and we know there are many of you, as well as all of our first-time participants. Thank you very much for joining us. As many of you know, Demy-Colton's mission is all about convening healthcare industry leaders from multiple disciplines to catalyze change. And we do this through in-person events primarily in the healthcare space. Of course, COVID forced us to rethink how we execute on this mission, and that led to the launch of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series last year. We know the Virtual Salon Series will be here to stay because of the value that it provides, even after we get back to our new normal. We invite you all to go to our website to keep looking at the salons that are upcoming, and certainly we invite everyone to suggest a topic, recommend a topic, and speakers for us to showcase during our Virtual Salon Series. And as I noted, indeed, last year we were in the process of launching BioFuture, our new conference here in New York City, when COVID, of course, changed our plans. However, I am pleased to let you know that BioFuture will now take place October 5 and 6 in person with a virtual element here in Manhattan at CURE, Deerfield Partners' new virtual innovation space on Park Avenue South. Needless to say, we are really very excited to be able to launch BioFuture here at CURE by Deerfield. A quick note, as I mentioned before, Field Trip Health is one of our sponsors, and we thank them very much for joining us. And as well, I would like to thank all of the other sponsors of our virtual salons and the founding sponsors of BioFuture, which led us here. A few housekeeping notes before I turn over the virtual podium to our moderator and panelists. The structure of today's program is as follows. We will have a 50, maybe 55-minute discussion. That will be followed by a Q&A session. Everyone is invited to submit a question in the Ask a Question pane, which is right below your screen, and we will address as many as possible. Please do note that today's salon will be recorded and on demand for viewing later today. And now to today's salon, Psychedelics Get Serious. Our moderator is Walter Greenleaf, a distinguished visiting scholar at Stanford University's MEDIA-X program. Walter is a neuroscientist as well as a virtual reality and digital health expert. His panelists include Adam Ghazali, the David Dolby Distinguished Professor of Neurology, Physiology, and Psychiatry at UC San Francisco, and founder and executive director of Neuroscape. Charlie Hartwell, Managing Director of Bridge Builders Collaborative. Ronan Levy, Co-founder and Executive Chairman of Field Trip Health and our sponsor for today. Katerina Malievskaya, Chief Innovation Officer, Co-founder of Compass Pathways. And Bera Yazar Klozinski, Chief Scientific Officer and Deputy Director of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to Walter. Walter.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, and it's really exciting to be here with such a fantastic panel to talk about such an exciting topic. We have a short amount of time and a lot of exciting material to cover, including some questions that have already been provided by the audience. So I'd like to jump right in by asking our panelists to introduce themselves briefly, to talk about what they're most passionate about in this arena. So perhaps, Vera, we could start with you giving a bit of an overview of who you are and what you're doing and what you're most excited about.
Yeah, thanks, Walter. It's a pleasure to be here. So I've been working with MAPS for the last 12 years, and I've worked on all the clinical trials that MAPS has sponsored. So MAPS is a nonprofit 501c3 tax-exempt charity organization that's also a clinical trial research sponsor. So MAPS has been around for 35 years, and we're really excited about our latest study publications about our phase 3 clinical trials of MDMA-assisted therapy for treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. So this program has been ongoing since 1985, when the first general toxicology studies were conducted, and we opened an investigational new drug trial with FDA in 2001. So you can imagine how exciting it is to see the fruits of all this labor of the collective organization and the donors and the therapists and the patients to all come to fruition. Just last month in May has been definitely a tidal wave of exciting news.
Well, MAPS has been a prime mover in this arena for so long. So, and as a nonprofit, you've had a really fantastic role moving things forward in a way that's comfortable with many of the constituents in this community. Very exciting.
Yeah.
Next, I'd love to have Adam, if you could spend a moment giving your background. I've known you as a wonderful leader and scientist in our arena, not just in terms of your work at UCSF at Neuroscape, but also helping some of the emerging digital health technology companies.
Hi, thanks. I'm really excited to be here with this group. I know all of you, and I'm excited for our conversation today. I am a professor at UCSF, so I wear the full-time academic hat in this group, although I have had some work in industry. I'm a neurologist and a neuroscientist, and my main job, my day job, is running a research center at UCSF called Neuroscape. And what we do there is both develop and then validate interactive experiences as medicine, what we call experiential medicine. What we're probably most known for is a video game that we started 10 years ago, and became a study in Nature in 2013, and then went on and became the foundational technology of a company called Achille Interactive, who just last year received FDA approval for a video game, for this video game as a treatment for ADHD. So you might be asking yourself, what does video games have to do with psychedelics? Over the years, I became interested not just in video games as an experiential medicine, but thinking about how psychedelics induce their effects not just through molecular interactions, but by inducing experience. And so we just announced earlier this year that at Neuroscape, we're launching a new psychedelics division that will be headed by a real leader in the field, Robin Carhart-Harris, who's joining us just in a couple of weeks. And our goal is to understand how the contextual elements of the treatment, of the experience itself, leads to outcomes. We could talk more about that in a bit.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's such a key part of understanding. We're not just talking about molecules when we talk about the introduction of psychedelics therapeutically. There is such an important part of the context, the set and setting. Well, Charlie Hartwell, I'd love to have you introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about what you're passionate about. I've known you for a while as a person who cares deeply about how to, as an investor, make the right decisions to move things forward in a proper business way, not just emphasizing profit, but the way to have the best social impact as you move forward as an investor. So I'd love to have you talk about your passion and what your excitement about this arena.
Well, thanks, Walter, and thank you to all the panelists. It's really fun to be on with all of you. And I'm the managing director of a group called the Bridge Builders Collaborative. We started first 10 years ago. We were really the first professional investors that I know of investing in spaces like digital therapeutics. We invested in, in pair therapeutics and Happify Health. We were the first professional investors in mindfulness. We invested in Headspace and Insight Timer and 10% Happier, and invested in other sort of behavioral health and mental health companies. We're really focused on investing in sort of Series A startup companies around mental health, consciousness, and spirituality. And our passion as we enter this field is really to support what we believe is a sort of a potential, if done right, for transforming our behavioral health system. Also, we believe these tools can really help people to awaken to their potential, to their purpose, et cetera. So we see this as a really good opportunity for both mental health and societal transformation.
Fantastic. We will definitely come back to that aspect of the opportunity here. And Katja, as I've gotten to know you as a clinician and as the founder of Compass Pathways, I'm so excited about what your attitude and your approach to this. I'd love to have you elaborate a little bit about your journey, your role at Compass Pathways, and what you're most passionate about.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It's really exciting. So I am a physician, not a psychiatrist, and I was a practicing physician in the US for many years. I also worked in public health and academic medicine, and never thought much about psychiatry beyond prescribing antidepressants. And only when our family became on the receiving end of mental health care, I recognized how much can be done to actually improve patients' experience with mental health care, with psychiatry, and how significant the unmet need is and how much suffering there's out there. So with that in mind, we founded Compass together with my husband, George Goldsmith, and another co-founder, Lars Wilde. And Compass, we think of ourselves as a mental health care company. And it's broader than just pharmaceutical company. We do obviously employ techniques and principles of specialty pharma in drug development, but we take a broader look at issues of mental health care. So we take a truly cross-functional, interdisciplinary approach to designing the care models for patients who currently don't have any effective treatments, and the need in psychiatry is really significant. There is our target patient population is patients who don't have any effective treatments. You'll be surprised, but there are clinical conditions in psychiatry that don't have any approved treatments. So if I am to run a comparative effectiveness study, I have nothing to compare the treatments with. So it's the 21st century, and we think it's unacceptable. So we are on the mission to address significant unmet need in mental health care space.
Oh, that's such an important point. And I know that the challenges that we will have as we move psychedelics out into mainstream clinical care are going to be multiple. And it starts with some of the challenges with doing clinical trials and not being able to do the comparisons that you mentioned. So this is a topic that hopefully we'll come back to and have a moment to expand upon. Next, Ronan, I'd love to have you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Field Trip Health, and also what you personally are very passionate about.
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for everyone being here. At Field Trip, we are the largest vertically integrated company in psychedelics, which means we have two operating divisions: Field Trip Health, which is building out the clinical infrastructure to actually deliver psychedelics therapies at scale. We have locations opening across North America and some in Europe presently, using ketamine-assisted therapy, but being positioned to work with companies like Compass, organizations like MAPS, to help them roll out the delivery of their care models as well. And on the other side, we have Field Trip Discovery, which is our research division focused on advancing work with FT104, a novel psychedelic molecule that we've developed internally, leveraging what we think to be some of the best aspects of the 5-HT2A classical serotonin-focused psychedelic molecules, but addressing some of the key limitations in psilocybin, particularly in terms of the long timeframes associated with it, as well as enabling robust IP for the work we're doing. And our focus is really kind of touching on what Adam and Charlie touched on, is figuring out how the interplay of the experience and the context, as well as the pharmacology interplay. So if Adam's doing it on an academic level, we're doing it on a business level, focused on innovation and understanding the interplay of those two seemingly key components to the efficacy of psychedelic therapies. In terms of what I'm passionate about, I'm going to lean on Charlie's answer a little bit. Certainly love innovation and disrupting current paradigms around mental health, but also very interested in the social and cultural context of what this psychedelic renaissance is going to achieve, both through the medical application and beyond. So that's what keeps me motivated every day and most nights.
Well, and I think we will definitely come back to that point, because I think later in our panel discussion, we're going to talk about not just the excitement and the opportunities of this emergent approach in clinical care, but also some of the concerns and the risk. And what you and Charlie have identified is certainly an area that we have to pay close attention to. Well, thank you, everyone, for the very brief introductions. I know we could spend days going deeper onto what each of you are doing specifically and how exciting it is, but we do have a short amount of time. So I think what I would like to do now is just move into a phase where we talk a little bit about what's going on. There certainly is a tipping point, in my opinion, of the acceptance of psychedelics, both legally and also, I think, by the clinical community. And there's been a number of things contributing to that. But perhaps what we could start with is hearing from Adam and from Bera, the neuroscience and the research that has helped put us at this point of introducing psychedelics in a more robust therapeutic manner.
Well, happy to give a little background there. This is an impossible task at a short amount of time.
I'm sorry about that.
Yeah. It's minimum of an hour lecture, but just to create the playing field, you're going to hear about a lot of different compounds that we're talking about, and they're not the same. They have different receptor binding profiles and mechanisms of action. We're lumping them all in psychedelics, so that also adds to the complexity of this conversation. They include what we might refer to as the classical psychedelics, and those act on the serotonin 2A receptor as agonists, and they include things like mescaline, LSD, psilocybin, DMT. You'll also hear a lot about ketamine, which has actions on MDMA receptors and beyond, and MDMA, which has actions on serotonin and dopaminergic systems. The thing that's most clear is that there's not just one simple action point for any of these compounds. They have a complex array of influences on neurotransmitter systems. So just to create that as the playing field, when I look at the scientific literature, I see two dominant areas of contribution from academic research. One is in the very basic neuroscience, chemistry, biology of these compounds. What are the receptor systems they act on? Do they induce plasticity? That's the changing of the nervous system in a very active way. Do they have anti-inflammatory properties? That work is often done in a dish, on cultures, or in animal models. Lots of great work there. And then on the complete other side of the spectrum, you find these very elaborate and complex and incredibly important clinical trials. So those are phase 2, phase 3 trials that are designed to show that there is efficacy with a low amount of side effects, or at least a reasonable amount, that can lead to these compounds being approved by the FDA for the treatment of different clinical indications. And those are advancing remarkably, as you've already heard about MAPS. There is another, so those are the two visions, those are the two main dominant areas if you look at the scientific literature. The very basic science and this really promising clinical efficacy, which is why we're on this call today. There's another area that is less represented in the scientific literature, but you've already heard it come up several times, and that is we are not fully clear about how you translate from these basic science findings to the clinical efficacy. The one thing that's agreed upon in the field, and I know everyone on this call agrees upon, is that it's not a simple molecular leads to action leads to clinical outcome, which you can see with other medications, especially like medications in the infectious disease space or cardiology. Here it's a lot more complicated. What seems to occur is that these compounds induce these very basic molecular effects, and then they create an experience, and that experience can lead to an outcome, either good or bad. We call that set and setting or contextual influences. And we now appreciate that they occur both before you enter the treatment phase, how you come in with your intentions or what psychological context you have, or even if you have a mental health condition, what happens during the treatment itself, and then how you integrate and process that afterwards. And although we all agree that this is critical, there's a lot more research to understand how we can deliver these treatments in the most effective way. So that's a little bit of the playing field, and you'll hear some of that come out in conversation today.
Yeah, I just have a few words to add to what Adam was explaining, which is that what we see, particularly with MDMA, but I'm sure with other psychedelics too, is that the compounds are able to trigger signaling cascades that deploy neurohormone effects, specifically around oxytocin and vasopressin, but also cortisol, prolactin, and adrenocorticopic hormone. So what these do is that they actually open up the mind and body to be more susceptible to external factors. And this is particularly why set and setting is so important. And these are endogenous mechanisms that already exist in the body and that are utilized throughout development in order to enable plasticity in the brain. And essentially, the mechanism is all in there. And this is why the basic tenet of our treatment model is to follow the inner healing intelligence. And it's because the body's got it all. You just have to deploy the resources and mechanisms there.
Wow. Well, thank you, Adam and Bera, for giving us that foundational perspective and also for emphasizing an area that is of great concern, which is how do we roll out to a larger audience these very well-needed, important therapeutic interventions, but without ignoring and somehow leveraging the need to have the right contextual situation, the right set and setting to have a better combination therapy through that mechanism. And I think that brings us to Compass Pathways and Katja, and the challenges with clinical trials for psychedelics. There's so many dependent variables, so many issues as you are contributing to next generation interventions in mental health. And given what Adam and Bera have emphasized about the complexity of more than just the molecule, more than just the biosignals we might be measuring and the subjective report of improvement, it's creating the right context even to do a clinical trial. So how are you navigating that maze as you bring forward Compass Pathways?
Yes, thank you. I have to say that all the kind of scientific discoveries and academic studies that were done in the last couple of decades, they really picked the interest of regulators. So when we first had our very first interaction with European Medicines Agency, we came with our proposal. They actually came armed with, a bunch of studies. They knew the research. They were interested in the research. I have to say that they were actively engaged, and the regulators, FDA and European Medicines Agency, and regulators in 12, 13 different countries that we interacted with, they are very aware of science, and it's super important to have conversations with regulators early and frequently in order for them to kind of co-create this path of clinical development, moving towards regulatory approval. And it's partly because it's been essentially no innovation in psychiatry, and I think the latest kind of approval of ketamine is very exciting, but I think it's not enough and definitely doesn't cover all the unmet need. And secondly, I think everyone is affected. Regulators are people too, and they have family members who are affected by mental health issues. So I think in this situation, we're all in it together. We're all moving in this direction. But in terms of challenges with clinical trials, I would say there are two main challenges with development of psychedelics. We are developing psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression. We're in phase 2B clinical trial. That is a dose-finding study. We compare 3 different doses, low, medium, and high, and effects of these doses on symptoms of treatment-resistant depression. And the challenge is that the current system of scales, psychiatric scales, they were developed in 1950s and 60s, and they're not optimal to measure what happens for patients during these experiences. We're not convinced that they adequately reflect the value that is created for patients and perhaps for health systems. And so the challenge is to see how else can we capture that value that is created by this approach, these treatments. And another interesting challenge is, as Adam said, that it's not just mechanism of action. There is a subjective mechanism of change that is involved. Something happens in this experience. There is a sense of agency that patients get in touch with, and it creates a relationship between a patient and the symptoms of depression. And sometimes patients tell us that, the symptoms of depression may come back, but I don't get engaged. We can coexist. And that is very difficult to capture. And, perhaps the very first time in kind of clinical research or clinical development in psychiatry or in research in depression, we have to pay attention to the quality of the experience. Normally in clinical trials, we would say that, it sort of pollutes the data, or, it makes it more challenging to interpret. But it really matters what kind of experience patient had and how this experience affects the outcomes and perhaps the longevity of the effects. So there's some of the challenges of clinical development, but also the opportunities. Perhaps it gives us an opportunity to look at the, mechanisms of disease and identify the new therapeutic targets and new therapeutic approaches.
Well, you're certainly correct to identify the unmet needs in mental health care, in particular for the clinical indications that we have. Things are very backed up. Someone finally makes that very difficult phone call asking for help, and they're told they have to wait 4 or 5 months, or that the interventions that are possible are expensive or have side effects. We do seem to be at an amazing tipping point right now in terms of the opportunities here, and we should spend a moment talking about that. But you mentioned how hard it is to measure some of the important qualities of this therapeutic experience. And I would have no idea how we could go about measuring the experience of awe. That's something that we don't have the good metrics for. That being said, I am excited that we now are with the surge forward of new assessments enabled by biosensors and our ability to create an experience and measure someone's behavior. I think digital health, which is surging forward along with some of the new therapeutics that we're talking about today, I think will complement each other very well. So I very much appreciate the constraints that both the science and the clinical care and research are having, but I also think there's help on the way. But perhaps this is a good question to throw to you, Charlie. As you're looking at this from your perspective as an investor, and you have to take a bit of a helicopter perspective, looking at the overarching situation, both from a business and also from a science and research viewpoint, and also because your group is focused on impact investments. What are the ramifications of the evolutions of this technology? As you look at the emergence of psychedelic assisted therapy as a transformative opportunity, what are you concerned about, and what are you excited about, and what needs to happen in your mind to really get this right?
So I'll start with what I'm excited about, and with appreciation for the people that are on this call that are like really working hard to create a whole new paradigm opportunity. In the mental or behavioral health space, I would say the research and everything that I've learned from wisdom traditions and experience says that we have an opportunity to revolutionize our behavioral health system if we do this right. We have the ability to switch from a healthcare model, which I would say has been based on sort of a saviorism model, where we look outside ourselves to a drug or a doctor or someone else to fix us. And with these medicines, we're actually looking inward to understand ourselves better and to be able to transform and permanently transform some of the trauma and behavior which is causing us suffering in the first place. And that's pretty remarkable, because depending on which compound is being studied, this can happen in as little as 1 to 2 experiences with a properly trained practitioner. And this is about like healing. It's not about managing conditions. It's about actual healing. So there is a whole opportunity here to create a whole new ecosystem that really facilitates a significant shift in mental health. Along with that, I have probably more concerns in some way than I have, excitement, because we're playing with something here that is extremely powerful. And I'll outline some of my concerns. First of all, if we lose the wisdom of the traditions that brought us to this point, or if we use and abuse those traditions and that wisdom and these elders, that's not good. I'm really concerned, as there are now something like 50 publicly traded companies in the space. I'm concerned that this will be about competition and domination, and that people will start making false claims, and that could lead us back, to where we were in the 1970s. Some bad experiences here could create a lot of backlash in this field. So a lot of care needs to be taken to that. I'd say another concern is how well are the practitioners going to be trained? Because we, and at least in my belief, is that all practitioners over a period of time who are practicing this should have experience with the medicine in order to be able to do that. There's not a legal framework, necessarily to do that right now. And then
When you say experience with, I just want to clarify, you mean they should try it, right?
They should have experienced what, I mean, if you're going to be present to somebody to an experience that many people would describe as one of the most important experiences in their life, then it's really important to have, first of all, done your own personal work as a therapist and removed as much of your own trauma, but also to have experienced this medicine so you can be in better relationship with the person and understanding what they're going through. You know, at the end of the day, I think my greatest concern is that, is that capitalism and greed is going to, win the day here. And, I was talking to an employee of a company that's a publicly traded, company in the space, and they joined the company just months ago because the company was patient focused, and they said the company has now become profit focused and bottom line focused, and that shift is really important to how this field is going to develop. If it's all about minimizing cost and degrading the experience so you can make more profit, then we're not actually going to facilitate transformation. But at the same time, I have a lot of concerns. Those are just a few of them. I also am, remarkably hopeful.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's one of the goals of having conversations like the one we're having today, is to connect different groups, both here on the panel, but also in our audience, to address some of these concerns. It really does seem like we're in many ways at a tipping point in the industry. Charlie, you mentioned the 50 public companies, but also I think there's something, I guess, more cultural going on in terms of accepting this approach, moving more from recreational and underground to something that is a little bit, for better or for worse, much more clinical and scientific, et cetera. And on Friday, the governor of Texas signed a bill that will require the state to study the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. So something has really changed. And I'd be curious from hearing from the panel, what do you think has engendered this tipping point? And how can we leverage it to move forward in a way that gets things done correctly along the lines that Charlie suggested?
I can take that because I've definitely experienced the shift over time. So when I first started working on the clinical trials that MAPS was sponsoring, it was incredibly challenging to convince ethics committees of the value of studying this in a clinical trial. It was really challenging to get any publications through the peer review process. And these are all ways that that bias inserts itself against the psychedelic programs of research when, any novel chemical entity would not be subject to that kind of bias. And it really just boils down to fear of loss of control from psychoactive effects, in my opinion. And that is really how psychedelics ended up in Schedule I as the most restricted class of controlled substances in the first place, because there was no better place to put them. So that's what we've heard from some of our consultants who really, help us out with the rescheduling discussions. So, and this is also what really was foundational for the plan of taking psychedelics through the regulatory approval process, because that's literally the only thing that DEA will bow down to in terms of changing scheduling. Even when a compound is approved by FDA, has a legitimate medical use, such as Epidiolex, which is CBD, they still wanted to keep it somewhat scheduled in Schedule 5 initially, and then through additional efforts from the sponsor company, it was ultimately completely descheduled. And this is in the complete absence of abuse potential. So based on the research. So I think that stigma has really shifted over time because people have been so perseverant, in actually getting the publications through the peer review process. There's over 5,000 publications on MDMA or ecstasy if you look on PubMed. And in general, we always see that the studies that are funded by by government grants always have to put in the obligatory line that, these results, it's like a spin, right? These results show that a better, safer compound that's not psychoactive would be preferable. And the entire study has nothing to do with that.
I think there are a lot of factors at play right now. I mean, certainly what Bear is talking about, but there's a lot of social and cultural factors. Certainly the research we're seeing is really quite persuasive, from Compass's work to the work with MAPS to a lot of the academic work. We've seen very strongly held conventions, specifically vis-a-vis cannabis, change, and look, the sky is not falling. Society seems to function very well. I think there's been a significant pushback in conventional pharma approaches, triggered in part by the opioid crisis and questioning the conventions around what we have built, and people now looking for more holistic, proactive approaches to healthcare as opposed to the reactive approach that allopathic medicine tends to drive on. Mental health has certainly gone mainstream, as Charlie can attest to with Muse and Headspace and Calm and all of these kind of things. All of that's happening right now. And so I think all of that lays a foundation for people to be very open-minded to it. I mean, we're getting there. We conducted a study through YouGov, which showed that close to half of Americans would either be willing to try psychedelic-assisted therapies or would be open to learning more about that. And we're just starting. This conversation has only gone mainstream, I think, in the last year to 2 years, realistically.
You bring up a very interesting point, Rowan. Oh, please go ahead, Katerina.
Yeah, I would also just quickly add that there's one angle whether the substances should be scheduled and why they're scheduled. But then there's, maybe because that's my lens and that's how I sort of approach our work. But I see just tremendous unmet need in mental health and no effective treatments and approaches. And the, with COVID, it became even more obvious how huge the need is and how little we have to offer. So I think it's a confluence of scientific studies that show, effects, efficacy, safety, and as I said, we're all on the same boat. We all know someone who has been suffering with mental health issues. So I think it's a confluence of different factors.
Yeah, I'd like to just add on. I was going to say something very similar to Katya, but from my own lens, which I think that it's bigger than psychedelics. That is part of the story. But from the perspective of someone that just took a video game through a medical device pathway successfully, there's clearly a growing appetite for new treatment modalities. And that's driven by the incredible unmet need. I mean, for 70 years, we've had a particular pathway, like a vision of this magic brain pill that you're just going to pop in your mouth and autism's gone, schizophrenia, depression, Alzheimer's is gone. And that has not happened. We have failed dismally. And we've seen many other fields, infectious disease and cardiac disease, show much more favorable trends over time. But suicide, anxiety, depression, dementia are getting worse. And so I think that when you look through the perspective of the patients, the families, the regulators, the doctors, the insurance companies, everyone's like, we need something new. This is just not working. And it's still really hard, but I think psychedelics, digital therapeutics, they're all part of this same need-based driven approach that we need to think out of the box. We need to relax the paradigm that we believed was going to fix the brain. It's just not working. We have to be more creative and more innovative in how we do that.
And I think Rowan's point that cannabis helped prime the acceptance of moving into this direction from a cultural and social and medical legal viewpoint. In so many ways, cannabis has been the gateway drug to the acceptance of psychedelics in our culture. In our scientific community. But one of the issues, though, that has been identified by one of the questions asked by our audience is how do you think the scientific and clinical community will view recreational use of these compounds? In many ways, the torch has been moved forward by groups that have been pushing for the legalization for these powerful therapeutic approaches, have come from that underground community. But now, as we move forward to come up with more effective therapeutics that leverage what heretofore was illegal compounds, how does that interplay? Will it become a little bit harder to say that you're microdosing a recreational drug when really they're now starting to be viewed as very powerful therapeutic medications? And does it matter? I don't think it's something we can spend much time on, but I'd be curious what members of the panel think about that concern.
I take the perspective that at least what we're seeing in terms of legislative change and the grassroots activism, it looks a lot like what has been or is being established in the state of Oregon, which is I'm not familiar with many people who suggest that access to psychedelics should be made available, on a take-home basis. I think most people who are advocating for broader access, even outside of the medical context, still want it on a controlled basis in controlled settings, even if it's not medical. And so I think that gives me a lot of comfort that maybe we will get to a point where we feel comfortable in society providing recreational access to psychedelics. We're not there yet. There's a path, and I could see how we could get there. But I think what's happening right now is very conscious and very thoughtful about, what we're seeing is there is a significant unmet medical need in terms of depression, anxiety, all of these DSM indications, but there is also a significant unmet non-DSM social need of people craving connection and awe and wonder and some of these other terms that we talk about that don't fit a medical paradigm, but I think are very significant from a social and cultural perspective.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to add that this is not a novel concept. I mean, small doses of ibogaine were marketed in France under Lamborghini many years ago for this very purpose in the early 1900s of all times. So I think that it's one of the things that's not immediately apparent to an outside observer is that in states such as Oregon, the state health authority board is mandated to actually set standards for use that will regulate the credentials and training of any facilitators who are providing psychedelics for outside of a fully approved medical context. And so this really means we need a third category, that we shouldn't be lumping this use into recreational, because by definition, recreation is that you're using it like alcohol or, potentially going overboard and not necessarily following any rhyme or reason in terms of the use.
Well, and throughout our time together as a panel, we've emphasized that we all acknowledge the importance of the contextual situation for using these compounds clinically. And I think that's something that in many ways is going to be as important as any of the molecules that we're talking. And that's something that outside of the clinical context is uncontrollable and perhaps could be adverse. So I think there's arguments for all aspects of this. And it's something that will be interesting to see how we evolve as things surge forward, and they really are surging forward. I'd like to take a moment to address one of our other audience-generated questions, and that's the issue of dosing and personalized care for as we introduce these compounds. Do you think we'll be able to come up with a predictive model for an individual now that we're coming up with a whole complex layer of therapeutic care involving both very complex compounds, as Katerina described? There's issues involving measurement of subjective parameters in order to come up with the best clinical pathway. We know that we have some very powerful tools now, but we also know it's a complex situation. So I'd love to hear from the panel their thoughts about both the challenges and the risk as we move forward, bringing out psychedelics into clinical care.
So I'll just start with expanding this thought further, because when you say that you're talking about a particular dose for a person, I want us to think about the whole set and setting. So for someone who may be, an African American with trauma, they, it doesn't matter what compound they have. Having someone that understands their cultural context as a practitioner is extremely important. So I sometimes think, again, that we rely so much on believing the compounds themselves are the solution here. It's really the set and setting. Ronan's doing a lot of work on this, obviously, at Field Trip. It's who are you talking to? What is the intention? What is the location where you're doing this? What is the musical setting? And that makes this formula even more complex that you're asking about, because certainly there's a question about the dosing of the compound, but it's actually a much bigger question. And dosing is a moment. The healing, for people takes weeks and months working with a practitioner in order to actually see the type of results that I think we all want to see.
Maybe I can chime in here. I think that's exactly the issue, Charlie, that you mentioned. I think, and it also contrasts nicely the kind of recreational and non-medical kind of personal development type of approach from, strictly clinical and use in clinical context. I think the challenge here is to predict who will respond to what dose. We know that there is a lot of intrapersonal variability. That is, the same person can take the same dose and have completely different experiences, or two different people can take different doses and will have similar experiences. So we don't really have a handle on how this unfolds, and a lot of it is left to the intuition of the healers, practitioners, guides, but how do we not leave it to chance? And the role of, further advancing of science and clinical development is to understand how do we improve the chances of generating the particular type of experience that correlates with maximum efficacy and maximum sustainability of the effects. And that is the personalized, predictive, and preventative model. That requires a lot of research, a lot of data, and a lot of scientific expertise, and obviously a lot of resources. So that's the goal that we have for ourselves, to actually optimize this, the quality of the experience, and optimize the efficacy, safety, and sustainability of the effects.
Katja, maybe I could just jump off of that. You always set me up so perfectly. That's exactly what the goal is of our new division at Neuroscape. That's why Robin's traveling around the world to join us, is to do exactly what we've been talking about from our perspective as academic researchers running deep dive studies in a laboratory, to start understanding what are the ingredients and the recipe to create the most meaningful and sustainable outcomes. And just to give a little details to that, how we're approaching that is really a two-tiered approach. The first is, right now it's a black box what's going on. Maybe the best therapist in the world with 50 years of experience could look at someone laying there silently and know that at this moment they're suffering, or at this moment they're in awe. But for the most part, we don't know what's going on inside someone's brain during this treatment, during this experience. It's rather inaccessible. And so the first pass is what we call multimodal biosensing. We'll be recording physiology and neural activity with the latest in biosensors, and working with leaders in signal processing and machine learning to really understand how the state of an individual unfolds over time, in real time, and then try to understand what the peak experiences are during the treatment that then translates to the enduring outcomes that we're looking for. So that's one tier, is to look inside this black box during the treatment. The other is, how can we guide participant, a patient, more effectively. And with that, we're very interested in the sensory context, what they see, hear, smell, feel. This is almost completely unexplored in the prospectively designed research study. And we think that it's not that you're pushing someone in a place necessarily, you're creating the context for them to then go on this journey and reach healing moments or enlightenment moments or whatever change you're looking for. And so when we understand what's happening in the brain during a treatment, and we understand the different levers of sensory experience that might lead to better outcomes, then we get to what we call the closed loop psychedelic treatment. And what that means is that a therapist would have a new set of tools, so they don't have to have been doing this for 50 years, where they can understand what's happening in the moment to their patient, and then have all these levers of what they can introduce from smells and music to help guide them most effectively. So that's the future that we envision.
I'm just going to add one quick thing on top of that. I know Sarah just showed up, so I'll keep it brief. But at Field Trip, we're doing the exact same thing, but instead of doing it in an academic controlled perspective, we're taking a big data approach of actually treating people and collecting all of the circumstances and dynamics and who the therapists are and every piece of data that we can collect around it, and then trying to generate an understanding through a big data model, machine learning, as opposed to a clinical context. But both are relevant, and both will lead to, I think, a far greater understanding.
Well, the nature of this panel, I think, is emblematic of the way we all, from different perspectives, different backgrounds, different talents, different skills, different objectives, can work together to address both this opportunity and this challenge. I think it's going to take a community of experts passionate about solving these problems to work together collaboratively, and I think we can. And I've really enjoyed the opportunity to hear from the panel. I guess I will also close with mentioning that we have to be careful. We don't want to build into our machine learning and data sets and algorithms biases. We also need to, as we develop these therapeutic applications, make sure we design for access so that we don't have underserved communities that need these clinical solutions so desperately, but can't reach us because of economic or distance or cultural barriers. So I know that the people on this panel are committed to that approach, and I'm so glad we've had a chance to spend some time with each other. Sarah, thank you for helping to arrange this.
And thank all of you for joining us. I actually think our time has been very, very short, just based by the number of questions that have been coming in at a very rapid pace during these last few minutes. I know that this conversation could go on for quite a while, and as all of us have discussed, mental health is now front and center stage of post-pandemic. And the unmet need that all of you have discussed is absolutely there, and it's been around for a long time. So with that said, for all of you who are viewing right now, we are going to shift into our Q&A period. We ask anybody who has to depart to fill in the survey before you leave. But in the meantime, let's move on to the Q&A. Okay, Walter, we have a lot of work to do here.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah, so how do you, okay, let me try to get to, I'm going to try to ask the shorter questions first a little bit. Are you looking at genetics to determine safety and efficacy for the patients? Walter, who do you think should take that one?
Oh, I think we've got several very competent scientists. Adam, Vera, Katja.
Yeah, I mean, I can take that just from the standpoint of the clinical outcome measures that FDA accepts, specifically in the Division of Psychiatry, really are unique to each kind of indication that's being studied, and is also very restrictive. So the measures of efficacy that we use have been the same measures of efficacy that were in use when Paxil and Zoloft were approved for PTSD. They've just gone through a slight update with DSM-5. And any proposal for surrogate endpoints such as genetics or epigenetic changes would absolutely have to first be validated, and that we don't feel that that's really a good use of donor resources.
Adam, Katrina?
Well, I think, go ahead.
Go ahead, Adam. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's so many important ways to characterize an individual to help lead to this predictive model. Mm-hmm. Knowing things about the genetics is one of them, but it's only one part of where we need to look at a person to understand them, to know how this is going to be most effective. I'm not aware of a ton of research that have started parceling the data and the heterogeneity and the geneity and the populations by genetics. It's certainly not our first goal. I think it's an interesting one, but it's not something that we've approached yet.
Yeah, there is evidence, not evidence, there are kind of reports of the, difference in response, people with different scores on Telegan absorption scale. Essentially, it's the quality of attention, ability to stay with the experience of the present moment, and there are, correlated genetic variants with correlated with this trait. So I think it's an interesting hypothesis. But the thing with data is, more data is not necessarily better. I think when you design your study, you need to know what you measure, why you measure, and as Barry said, the endpoints need to be validated for the purpose of FDA, but for the purpose of advancement of science, I think it's a very interesting question, but it's not ready for prime time.
Okay, thank you, Walter and Adam. This question is for you. Do you have a vision of specifically how digital therapies can be integrated with the psychedelic treatments? What is the model? Since psychedelics aren't FDA approved as of yet. What are you thinking?
I'll jump in. I think the digital layer of supporting psychedelic therapy is going to be complementary and critical. I think because of the complexity of the experience and to be able to set the context, we need to leverage technologies such as virtual reality and augmented reality technology. We also need to dynamically measure to the best we can someone's mood and emotional state, leveraging what we can with biosensors and also seeing any behavioral indications that we can get both during the experience but before and after. Also, to set that context, I think we need to leverage technology there too. So I think nicely enough, though, with the surge forward in digital health, we're developing some very powerful tools. And I think these tools not only can complement psychedelic therapy, but they can also be standalone, that they can be used when the person goes home, before they come in to see a clinician, to fill in the dots between sessions, or for people who aren't, it isn't appropriate to have this type of psychedelic therapy. They can also still address some of the problems and maybe help them find a pathway in preparation for a psychedelic experience. So yes, I think it's inseparable, and it will be complementary therapy in this regard will, I think, be part of how we go. But Adam, this question also is in your zone too.
I mean, I really don't have much to add. That was a great answer and was really exactly the same type of things that I was going to say. I would just add to maybe think about it in two buckets. Digital technologies can be used to both understand the person and the brain before, during, and after a treatment. So it's a way of offering a lot more information, which we all just discussed is really critical for the outcomes. And that can be done at home on a digital device that they may be recording elements of their experiences that happen after the fact, or it could be in a clinic or in a laboratory setting. And then the other side is how digital technologies can be used to change context itself. And so virtual sensory immersive experiences, and this is still a research question, may integrate very nicely with the psychedelic compounds and the perceptual shifts that they're causing. But it's still a big research question. So I think on both the intervention side and on the recording and diagnostic side, there's a very powerful opportunity to bring digital health and digital therapeutics together with psychedelic treatment.
Sarah, can I just comment on this for a second?
Absolutely.
Just to add one thing. So I actually think that there, you know, and of experience, there are actually therapies outside of this that may get people into these states and may become this type of therapeutics. I've had light experiences with light technologies. You know, Walter was mentioning VR. One of the most powerful experiences I've had is with VR, that as standalone. But let's not forget that you know, there are ways you just using breathing techniques to get into these states, and you know, people use that therapeutically as well. So I think that this is a really important area of discussion.
Okay.
You know, I think so. I think something that we need to start building into medicine in general is more of a personal narrative. Too often, people go to a clinic, they see a clinician, it's for a brief amount of time, they get prescribed an intervention, and then they come back a few weeks later. I think as we bring a digital layer to the therapeutic process, we also can start bringing story. We can bring narrative. We can make it a journey. We can make it a journey with people along the way who help, and we can bring in community. We can also leverage the learnings from our colleagues in the entertainment and gaming industry to make it to promote adherence. So I think it's more than just complementing the therapy with measurements and feedback. I think it's also expanding this to leverage the ways that people grow and learn, and that's through community, it's through connectivity, and it's being part of a journey that we do with our family and friends. So I think there's a lot we can do by expanding the look beyond just the molecule.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you, Walt, for that. One of our questioners wants to know how important the therapy side of psychedelic therapy is. Do they go hand in hand? Could they be separated? Do you need a therapist to go along with you? Walter, why don't I give that over to you, and then you can pop it over to Katya or Ronan.
Oh, well, I think it's critical. I think that because these compounds facilitate neuroplastic changes, I think they cannot be separated and eviscerated from the context of a therapeutic process without having potentially adverse effects. So from my viewpoint, and please add to it other experts on the panel, it's critical that there be a combination therapy approach, and that's one of the risks, I think, of bringing out in a rapid way these new interventions, is that if they get stripped away from the critical part of therapy, that they will have negative results or mixed results.
And another part to that particular question is, how do you control, or how difficult is it to control for clinical trials?
Yeah, I'll probably take that. Unless, Barry, you want to chat on this.
Yeah, I'm actually, I have a pretty good answer for this one. So,
good. Great, Barra. Great, Barra.
There's a newly emerging understanding on the part of the regulators that psychedelic assisted therapies represent a new category of intervention, which they're calling an integrated multimodal therapy. And I think this is really something that can, it's a holistic approach to defining what's going on, as opposed to a reductionistic, let's take it apart and see which one works better. Mm-hmm. And I think that, there's been so many studies conducted for mental health disorders and challenges where people have tried the medication, and then they've tried the psychotherapy, and then they've tried them together to try to take this kind of a 2x2 factorial design approach to deconstruct the parts. But as we're seeing from the commercial rollout of esketamine, where the therapy or any psychoactive effects were really separated from the psychedelic compound itself, I feel that this really leads to the need for more repeat doses, more frequently, and less spaced apart, because there's a reliance on the medicine, which is an external factor, as opposed to the inner healer, which is the internal factor. So with therapy, it's really about empowering the individual so that their mind and body is motivated to heal. And that motivation factor is something that I think can happen through therapy. It can happen through digital therapeutics. There's ways of supporting this. And we get this question a lot from regulatory agencies, like, why haven't you tried a 2x2 factorial design? And it's because we think of the effects are greater than the sum of their parts.
I think it's also important to consider how therapists
Daughters are allowed. Daughters are allowed. Daughters are loved.
I think there's two contexts, like Adam parsed apart before, the utility of digital therapeutics into two different categories. It's the same with the role of the therapist, because there's the notion, which is not very scientific sounding, of holding space, which means being present with the person during the actual psychedelic experience, helping to control and mitigate the risk of negative experiences. And then there's the part that Walter alluded to, which is taking advantage of the neuroplasticity in Bara as well. Is like, how do you take the openness, for lack of a better term, that comes from a well contextualized psychedelic experience and actually turn it into sustained behavioral change, attitude change, neuroplastic change. And so there's two separate roles, and they often get conflated. So I think we also need to be conscious of what aspect we're talking about in the role of the therapist. Certainly with the neuroplastic considerations and the motivation, a well-trained therapist is important. For holding space, I would suppose it's probably less relevant, but I don't know.
Yeah, I would also say that it is an opportunity, absolutely, because we think that there is a window of opportunity for therapy to work extremely well following psychedelic experience, but it's also a challenge because people in psychedelic state are very vulnerable and they're very suggestible. So any context that the therapist might bring into the session, any convictions, ideological, spiritual, political, doesn't matter. There is a, very, receptive patient on the other side, and it kind of the patient journey could be influenced if the therapists are not properly trained or super convinced by their personal experiences. So I think there is a ethical challenge or an opportunity to look at the training and look at the quality of care, quality of support delivered during and after psychedelic sessions, so as not to kind of influence patients who are extremely vulnerable in these states.
Okay, thank you. Thank you
Very
all for that.
Point.
So, Ronan, a questioner wants to know how healthcare providers can access the therapeutics that Field Trip offers for their patients.
It's really straightforward. You can either get in touch with us directly as a patient care provider, invite your patient to directly get in touch with us. Typically, we don't require referrals, although it is helpful. And just to avoid any doubt, we do screen patients quite carefully before we accept them for ketamine-assisted therapies in our clinics right now, because we do want to make sure, touching on a point I think Charlie raised early on, is this is still nascent. There's a lot of momentum. Things are very positive, but we got to still be disciplined in making sure we don't get out ahead of our skis, so to speak. And so we take that very seriously within Field Trip.
Thank you. So another quick question for everybody. And, Walter, maybe you can direct it to the right person. And Barrett, maybe you. How do we move the needle on the approval process for psilocybin-based treatment in the U.S.? What else has to happen? What's the timeline?
Oh, for psilocybin, MAPS actually doesn't have any psilocybin-assisted therapy studies going on. So I think that would be a better one.
Katja, I think that would be in your zone, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Psychedelics follow the same regulatory path as any medicine, and the requirements for clinical development of psychedelics, psilocybin, MDMA, or any other treatment are exactly the same. It's, phase 2B, phase 3, 2 positive results in phase 3, and all the wraparound, all the toxicology, all the pharmacotox, everything that traditionally is done in clinical development needs to be done, and so we are really racing towards it.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm sure many people are very happy to hear that, Katya. We are rolling up on time right now. I'd like to ask all of you, Walter, you'll go last since you're the moderator. We'll ask everybody else to go first, to talk about what you see in terms of the future applications of psychedelics for healthcare beyond what we've spoken about today. So Katya, why don't we start with you? If you'd like to punt it to somebody else, invite them.
Yeah. Maybe just one point I want to emphasize, that it's super important. I think Walt mentioned it briefly, but it's super important to make sure that the communities that don't necessarily have resources to go on private mushroom retreats or travel to other countries where psychedelics are legal do have access to these therapies. My sense is not only my sense that those are the communities with a lot of intergenerational and other trauma and a lot of mental health needs, and the challenges are to create the evidence not only for the regulatory approval, but also for the reimbursement and integration of these treatments into healthcare systems, and acceptance of payers, so this could be reimbursed, which would ensure true access.
Okay, great, wonderful. Adam, I see you shaking your head. Yes.
Well, I think we've discussed so many of the critical things. I was trying to reach as anything we haven't talked about, and this has been an underlying part of the conversation, but I feel that the field needs to evolve and maybe even heal ourselves in some way in the relationship between the many stakeholders here. We've talked about the patient in need, and obviously that's front and center, but it's a complicated space. There's indigenous communities that have practiced this as part of their religion and spiritual practice. There are therapists that have been going on underground for the last 40 years. There's the academics like myself. There are companies, there are investors. We all, I believe, the intentions are good. We all have the same goal, but we all are looking at it through different lenses and different mechanisms. And the quicker we become united and compassionate to each other, the better this field will do. I don't have an answer for that. I think conversations like this are a good step in that direction.
Well, we'll continue it when we do BioFuture here in New York City. So let me punt that over to Charlie.
So I'll just, from an investor point of view, I really hope this is a moment to actually look at how we invest and reconsider how we invest. So we're always investing, looking at the bottom line. This is an opportunity to actually really consider the impact and to really measure how, what is the impact of our investment, and is this delivered from, are these medicines and compounds delivered from a place of love, or are they delivered from a place of just, treating a patient and sort of letting them go? And the intentions that we hold together, as Adam was just saying, the intentions are really important, not only to the therapeutic experience, but also to how this whole field develops.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Charlie. I think compassion is a very big ingredient here. So, Ronan.
Sure. I may sound a little bit outlandish, but I do think the sky is almost the limit when it comes to the future applications of psychedelics. And that comes from the position that I think most people would agree that our current conventional allopathic reactive approach to medicine has created medical systems that are just not sustainable. I'm in Canada and we have a relatively well-functioning system, but it's starting to push the limits of what it can support. And I won't even comment on the U.S. system because I don't understand it nearly well enough, but I know it's got its significant challenges. We don't understand it either. and so what we see happening, I think, on a cultural level as well as a medical level, is the shift from allopathic reactive medicine to functional integrative preventive and proactive medicine. And I think psychedelics are going to be an essential part. We know that stress responses and gut health are tied. We know that gut health and inflammatory responses are tied. So as we start to make the reintegration of mind and body, or spirit and body, if you want to use that language, the role of psychedelics to be a part of that and increase overall well-being and health outcomes for people, not specifically tied to depression, anxiety, or other mental health conditions, I think is significant. And so I see significant applications, and we're starting to see that. I mean, there's research into psychedelics for Alzheimer's disease, migraine, cluster headaches. The anti-inflammatory effects are being explored for other reasons as well. So I really do think there's an incredible potential in the future of psychedelics.
Thank you, Ronan. Yeah. Bera.
Thanks, Sarah. So I feel that we're at a really crucial moment in time in history with the climate change and the environment, and I feel that psychedelics are the key to really unlocking the potential of what's inside of all of us. And I think that having the most holistic approach possible to healing the world and healing the systems that we have created in this world is going to be critical, to our success over the next 3 to 4 years. And through collaboration with all the counterparts that are represented on this call, I think we can do it all together.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bera. Walter, last word for you, please.
Well, I'd like to echo both the enthusiasm and the optimism that this group has had, and also the concern, of course, that we have a lot of work to do and we need to work together to do it. I would maybe suggest that even though it's been helpful to frame things in terms of psychedelics and the adjunct therapies and complementary therapies, really there's going to be a whole revolution in terms of new therapeutics, some of which are psychedelic, but some come from digital health, some come from stimulation of the auricular branch of the vagus nerve, that in a way we need to keep in mind that this opportunity and the complexity of it is intertwined with other things that are going on in the healthcare ecosystem and other neurotropic compounds, other approaches. So we've got a lot of work to do. We can do it together. It's exciting. We're going to be addressing some hard problems, but I think we need to be very collaborative. And I don't think there's real competition at all. I mean, the challenge here is the enemy is inertia. And I think if we all work together, we can move things forward. And I think the spirit is there to do that.
Wonderful.
And Sarah, thank you for bringing this group together.
Oh, it's a great group. We want you all together, again in the future. Thank you all for that great discussion. Certainly this is a really important avenue of treatment. I do want to just speak to the audience and say, forgive us for going over time. We did, but as you can tell, this is a very engaging topic and one that will expand again in the future. Before we sign off, I do want to thank all of our sponsors again and thank Field Trip for sponsoring this particular salon. There is a brief survey that we'd like everybody to take, so please take that as you sign off. And then please join us for our next virtual salon, Humans versus Machines, on June 30th. It's a competition to see who can predict clinical development outcome. And it's really interesting already. It's really quite interesting. It's a 4-part series. That will be the first installment. With that said, thank you all. We're signing off right now. Thank you all for joining us. Thank all of our speakers.
Thank you.
Walter, Bera, Katya, Adam, Charlie, and Ronan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Bye now.